Hi, I'm Reverend Liz Lerner McClay. Welcome to First U Sunday morning. I'm the minister at the First Unitarian Church of Providence, where we are not currently together in body, but we are absolutely together in spirit. So let's light our chalice together, or your candle, or whatever it is you're using, and we'll use our words that we say every morning, adding again hope. This light burns also in our hearts, and it lights our path towards harmony and justice and hope for all. So these are difficult days, and we keep hearing that they're going to get harder. And here we are about to enter the holidays of Passover and Easter, but for now Passover, which is coming on Wednesday, a biblical holiday with a focus on plagues and lessons and transformation. What could be more fitting for our times? I figure you are probably at least a little familiar with the Passover story as it comes in the Bible in Exodus. The Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt, and God took notice, and God decided to use Moses as a spokesman and sent Moses to talk to Pharaoh to get the slaves freed, and Pharaoh said no, in part because God hardened repeatedly Pharaoh's heart, which is completely unfair and made things a lot harder on people, because what followed then famously were plagues. And here we are living in this time of pandemic, and the plagues have taken on a reality for me that they've never had before as my family moves through this holiday together. Usually what you do at a Passover Seder when you're celebrating the holiday is you have a cup of wine and you say the name of each of the plagues in Hebrew and in English. And as you do that, you dip your finger into the wine and you put a drop of wine on your plate to diminish your cup of joy, because indeed the cup of joy filled by liberation, the joy of liberation, is diminished by knowledge of the suffering that the Egyptians went through, because they too are people, children of the same God and sharers of the same reality and planet. And so there's mourning in the midst of the joy. And that's usually how the plagues play out in the Seder. And this year, they have just been so much on my mind because we are living in a time of plague. And I thought, let me go look more at them. And they're so striking. Dam, blood, Tzfardea, which is frogs. Dam, meaning that the river Nile turned to blood and the fish suffocated and no one had water for anything. Tzfardea, it says in Exodus, the frogs were everywhere. The frogs were in people's bedrooms. The frogs were in people's beds. They literally covered everything constantly while that was happening. Lice, the dust in the land, in this dry and dusty land, every bit of dust turned to lice. Hail and blight and boils, locusts that covered the ground so thickly that not an inch of earth could be seen, and devoured everything, filling all the trees, filling all the houses. Hosheh, darkness. It was dark for 3 days, not moonlight, not starlight, nothing. No one could see to go out. No one could make light. No one could do anything for 3 days. And finally, Makat Behorot, the death of the firstborn. And nobody needs me to interpret that to imagine how terrible that must have been. And here we are now living in a time of a different plague, and it really sharpens our focus on what that's like. And the thing that is so interesting is that while we talk in the Seder as if it was the Egyptians who were afflicted, in Exodus, the things that happened impacted everybody, not just the Egyptians, but sometimes also the Hebrews, and not just the people, but often the animals and the crops. Everything was impacted because, of course, we are all in this together. And so it really brings home that reality that somehow humankind struggles so hard to ever comprehend that we can distinguish ourselves in as many ways as we want to, but in the end, we are all together on this planet. And what happens to some of us happens in some way to all of us. And we are part of a whole, and there is no escaping that. And that is what the plagues showed, and that is what this pandemic also shows. And it's a lesson we need to learn. It's a lesson we need to learn and figure out how to honor. Because then we will start thinking about, how do we best take care of all of us together? How do we best take all of us together and stop drawing these distinctions and hardening our own hearts and living on the backs of some? at the expense of some for the sake of others. And as always, there's this idea that when we make that exodus, there is a promised land that is still waiting for us. And I am cherishing the hope that there are things we are learning now and will continue to learn that are going to move us towards that promised land in this journey that we're on. That's one of the two things I'm thinking about a lot as we're moving towards Passover this week. And the second thing is one of my favorite parts of every Seder, which is the Hillel sandwich. Now, there are lots of ways that a Seder celebrates the story and makes sure to try to teach the story of the Exodus in every way it possibly can. There's songs that you sing and stories that you tell and questions that even the youngest children get to ask. Lots of repetition, lots of participation, and there's ritual foods which all have significance in the story, reminding us of important aspects of the story. So there's matzah, which we eat, a flat bread, because when Pharaoh finally relented, when God finally let Pharaoh relent and allow the Hebrews to go, people didn't want to let the window close. So they ran out and they didn't have time for the bread to rise. So they just took the flat bread and ran. You eat also moror. I've got a little bit on this. I used a lot of it just now, but usually horseradish, something really bitter, something the kind of thing that can make you cry because it symbolizes the bitterness of slavery and the tears that had to have been shed by the slaves who were living like that. And then there's also charoset, which is usually a sweet mixture of nuts and fruit and a little wine mixed in order to have something sweet that represents the sweetness of freedom, the sweetness of the liberation. And the idea is you eat all these things in the course of the Seder to remind yourself of these themes throughout the Passover story. And there's other things you eat as well. But I'm only talking about these three because the other thing, a great Rabbi Hillel, who lived about the same time as Jesus, said, yes, we eat these things to commemorate the story of the Exodus. But Rabbi Hillel said, we should eat these things separately and we should also eat them together in what's called a Hillel sandwich. Can you see there's both the moror on the top and the sweet charoset on the bottom inside the pieces of matzah? Because, as Rabbi Hillel pointed out, these things participate in each other. They don't exist separately. The sweetness is often paired with bitterness, right? Even in the midst of a sweet and wonderful moment, we have the bitterness of knowing that it's going to end and the forethought of grief, right? And there's also sweetness even in the midst of heartbreak, the laughter, right, in the hospital waiting room or at a wake. And there's also the ways that even in the middle of a day of delight or wonder, we think about the way it's going to end, that we can't dwell in that day forever. So Rabbi Hillel said, in the time of freedom, there is the knowledge of servitude. And then the time of bondage, the hope of redemption. And so we eat them together because they participate in each other and they're tied in that way. Or as the poet William Blake said, joy and woe are woven fine. Or as the wonderful writer Maya Angelou said, whether you are happy or whether you are sad, it is wise to remember you are really in process. So the moror and the charoset, the bitter and the sweet, are parts of the whole, and we know we have before us unexpected sweetness in days to come, just like that last laughter at the wake or the hospital room. And we also know that there is bitterness ahead, and the details will become clear, but we know these things are there for all of us. So let them come, and honor them both, especially when they come together. If the bitterness makes you cry, then cry. And if the sweetness makes you laugh, then laugh. Because these are all part of life. And we can bear them. And we have each other to help.